Okay, so picking right back up where we left off, we were talking about opioids and opiates, and now we are going to move to stimulants. So, what are stimulants? Stimulants work to increase the activity of the nervous system, both the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And it does this in a way by increasing excitation. So, it can increase excitatory signals, or it can block those signals whose job it is to inhibit excitation. So by blocking inhibition, it's creating excitation. So a lot of people don't think of it this way, but by depending on what you're blocking and what you're activating, you can have different effects in the brain. We have a lot of different types of stimulants that fit this category. For example, nicotine, cocaine, and caffeine. Amphetamines and anything that's amphetamine-like, those particular types of drugs, as well as the synthetic cathinones, which of course include things like bath salts. And bath salts had gotten a lot of news worthy sort of moments because especially at certain doses, we're seeing that individuals do some very bizarre things. So let's talk about what amphetamines, which is a specific type of stimulant, what we have here. So amphetamines are a synthetic psychostimulant. We see that they produce effects like having a person be very alert. We see euphoric feelings, so feelings of high and happiness. We also see that it promotes this sustained effort, this perception that you don't need rest or you don't need sleep. Now, even though a person doesn't feel like they can just keep going, and amphetamines do in fact increase a person's productivity, the interesting thing is that it doesn't affect the quality of their work. So you're doing more and it's higher quantity, but the quality isn't improved. So what this means is that amphetamines increase our motivation to do things because we're accomplishing more, but it doesn't actually improve our cognitive ability. So it's not like amphetamines are this wonder drug that's making us smarter. It just makes us do more. One thing that's really important to note is that tolerance does develop really quickly for amphetamines, and so that means that it takes much more of the drug for us to experience the alertness, euphoria, and that sustained effort. Another really interesting thing about amphetamines is that when you have a person who uses amphetamines for a long period of time, so this prolonged use, they develop symptoms that look a whole lot like paranoid schizophrenia. And we see this kind of repetitive motion, people moving, and we see people having hallucinations, and they are, feeling like somebody's out to get them. And even a really well-trained clinician can't tell the difference between true paranoid schizophrenia and then amphetamine created, so long-term use amphetamine created symptoms. Really what you have to do is you have to know the person's history and do they have a history of drug use. Now, the good thing is that once a person stops using amphetamines, we see that these symptoms, these paranoid schizophrenic type symptoms, start to go away. And so this kind of gives us an idea of what mechanism is being impacted, because we see, for example, in schizophrenia, dopamine is a neurotransmitter that's highly affected in schizophrenia. And so obviously that gives us an indication that whatever's going on with this prolonged use of amphetamines must involve dopamine to create these kinds of symptoms. Some derivatives of amphetamine include methamphetamine, which many people are pretty well aware of, especially in the area of Southwest Virginia and in Appalachia, because of the opioid sort of epidemic. But not only with opioids, but you also see issues with other addictive substances, like in this case, methamphetamine. Another derivative of amphetamine is ecstasy, or MDMA. Here's just an example graph of the dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens. And so remember, the dopamine reward pathways are really important. We're going to talk about the different areas in the brain, like the nucleus accumbens and ventral tegmental area, which are really important when it comes to addiction. But specifically looking at the release of dopamine over the course of time here. So this right here, this is saline. So you can see that this is just like literally saltwater solution, right? It's there's nothing in it. There's no drug in it. It's not producing any kind of variation in dopamine levels that's really significant. If you look at the first sort of set of dose of methamphetamine, you can see here, so this would be the meth 1 right here. You can see a pretty big uptick in the dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens when this dose right here. And then when you have a much higher dose, you can see that release of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens to be pretty stark in terms of how quickly that release happens. And then, of course, you see it start to reduce over time. And then as tolerance develops, you'll see this peak actually get lower and lower because we're seeing this tolerance develop and the brain isn't responding as much to the drug, which is why people tend to increase those doses. Now, not only does the amphetamine work on the central nervous system, of course, it also works on the autonomic nervous system, which is part of the PNS, or the peripheral nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system reaction essentially to amphetamines is an increase in blood pressure. People will experience tremor, so like their hands will shake severely. They'll feel dizzy, they'll sweat and be nauseated. Over the long-term use of amphetamines, we do see that it can cause brain damage that is irreversible. Now, the brain can do a lot of things, and it can heal after a lot of trauma, but there are, of course, certain cases where the drug use and abuse has been severe enough that the person is not able to recover from that. And so that can be a really dangerous sort of mix if you have a person who's using for a really long time, for example, methamphetamine, and that causes permanent brain damage. Now, one way that amphetamines work is they act on dopamine transporters, but they actually run them in reverse, which can explain why we see such a stark rise in dopamine release after taking this particular drug. Now, this is sort of a really basic graph, just kind of talking about a particular metabolite that we see that's located in the frontal lobe, the frontal white matter area. And so what we're seeing here is that people who are using, in this case, these individuals are using methamphetamine over the course of a lifetime. As you see, the lifetime amount, as it increases in terms of dosage, you're seeing that the person is actually experiencing what we refer to as severe neuronal injury. So this metabolite is severely increased. That frontal white matter is severely reduced in these cases. So the amount of the metabolite is lower in this frontal white matter. And we also see this happening in brain damage in individuals who have demonstrated damage to the brain. And so it can be really, really dangerous, especially if something like this is irreversible. The person's not going to get that function back, even if they stop using the drug. Another area that I like to talk about when we talk about stimulants is the medications that people take, like Ritalin and Concerta, which is methylphenidate, and other amphetamines like Adderall that fit into those categories. Now, just like the other amphetamines that we talk about, it will cause the release of dopamine and norepinephrine, acts on serotonin, it stimulates the system. People say they feel more focused. Whether or not you have a condition like attention deficit disorder, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which would be ADHD, or attention deficit disorder, which would be ADD, which would, of course, be the reason why you would take something like Ritalin or Adderall. But But those individuals who, especially who don't have an issue, they don't have ADD or ADHD, but just want to ADHD, but want to focus. A lot of people will take these medications outside of the prescribed amount because they say, oh, well, it makes me more focused and do more. And as we've talked about before, these kinds of medications don't make you smarter or necessarily even better. It just makes you work without having to rest, and it stimulates the system. Another way that it works, especially with methylphenidate, is that it binds to those dopamine transporters and essentially prevents it from clearing the excess dopamine from the synapse. And when you do that, it causes more dopamine to be available to the neurons. And so that means that your neurons are going to take in more dopamine because of that. Now, another type of stimulant is a synthetic cathinone, which we also refer to as bath salts. And so when we look at any kind of particular cathinone, okay, this is amphetamine. It's an amphetamine-like stimulant. It works very similarly in terms of dopamine. It works very similarly in terms of drug effects. And so we see the same sort of thing with euphoria. We also see the person becomes more sociable and want to talk to other people. We also see a major increase in sex drive. And this is where we start to see some really bizarre things happen, where a person who's on bath salts might strip down and run around naked, and it's definitely some interesting effects. We also see that people tend to also be paranoid, and they get really agitated and experience hallucinations. This can be really dangerous because when you have decreased inhibition, you have that increased sex drive and increased sociability, but you also get the paranoia and agitation. Individuals can be really dangerous when taking cathinones, synthetic cathinones. The final one that we're going to talk about is nicotine. So nicotine is a component of tobacco. There's lots of ways today that you can take nicotine, even before. You can vape it, you can smoke it, you can chew it, you can do all sorts of things to get nicotine into the blood stream and into the brain. So when we're talking specifically about smoking, like cigarettes, for non-smokers, so if a person who is actually in the room with a smoker or the first time they ever smoke, it tends to cause the person to feel nauseated. It may make them throw up. A lot of people tend to cough, and then they'll sweat. So if a person isn't used to smoking cigarettes, and the first time they really get the nicotine in, they tend to have these kinds of effects. Individuals who smoke regularly and therefore are beyond this kind of first use effect experience relaxation. They also feel like they're more alert after they smoke a cigarette. And what this does is it activates your nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, and it opens ion channels to allow for the release of these chemicals, to allow for additional action potentials. And so if you look at how nicotine can impact the dopamine release, and specifically in the nucleus accumbens, because remember we're talking about the nucleus accumbens in terms of addiction, and we've talked about that with methamphetamine before. So all of the solid circles here, so these are all the solid circles. This is demonstrating that increase of release of dopamine specifically in the nucleus accumbens. And so you can see here there's a pretty sharp increase in a short period of time, within 30 minutes or so of being exposed to nicotine, that increases the release of dopamine. And we know that increase in release of dopamine is part of the addictive factor of this particular drug. Another thing too is to look at the open circles, which is the ventral tegmental area. And we're going to get to that in a little bit. But notice that the ventral tegmental area is also impacted in terms of exposure to nicotine and having an increase in dopamine release. But it's not, at this stage, it's not as impacted as the Nucleus accumbens. We're going to talk about the differences between those two later on in the class. So, if you have any questions, you can let me know, and I will do a separate video for alcohol so that we can break up some of these videos to make them a little bit shorter.